Hi folks, nice to see you again. So we have a bit of a special video today. So the second ever and the first ever lighting guys, but second ever talk on the channel where we talk to awesome folks from the games industry. And in today's sort of, I don't know, you call it episode or anything like that, we've got a very interesting chap, Scott Warren, who is a principal lighting artist in the games industry. And Scott, again, dude, thanks so much for being gracious with your time. Really appreciate it. And we're going to get into some really awesome topics regarding lighting. We got the MIRO as well, which we have a visual indication of, and when we talk about stuff. But Scott, dude, thanks so much. Tell us a little bit about who you are.
Yeah, hi Elliot. Thanks for inviting me to the show. I've been stalking you, as it were, a bit on LinkedIn for a while, so I'm glad that you reached out. But who am I? I'm a lighting artist. I've been in the game industry since 2006, fresh out of high school. I started when I was 19. I wish I had some dramatic story of how I got into it, but I sent an email and asked, like, hey, could you hire me? I don't have, well, I had a terrible portfolio, but I was like, hey, take a chance on me and I'll be awesome. And they were like, okay. And that was it. I've been doing it. This will be my 18th or 19th year, which has been a while. Now that I think about it.
That's awesome. That's 19 years of, is that pretty much all lighting?
So I thought I was going to be a world famous environment artist. That didn't work well. I can model a cube. Anything outside of that gets dodgy really fast.
Yeah, same.
The chamfers were amazing though, Elliot. Like the corners, ooh, chef's kiss. So I started in environment art for about a year, and then the second and third year was a pretty fast transition into VFX, the old Cascade system in Unreal. I authored gameplay effects on, DOT effects, on character kind of gimbal locked effects that would follow through the world. At weather, all the kind of standard issue VFX needs. And then by the third year, really at the end of year 3 and 4, being in the industry, a level designer asked me at High Res, like, hey, we don't have anyone to do lighting for these maps, and we have like 6 of them. Do you want to try it?
Okay.
I was like, sure. And so I just kind of threw myself into lighting in Unreal.
Dude, that's awesome. So it doesn't sound like there's from what I'm aware of, there's you didn't go sort of game art educational route. You kind of, it sounds like you're self-taught. Is that right?
There's another chat I had where I made the claim of like, yeah, I'm self-taught, and the host is like, no, you're not. Like, what? What do you mean? And he's like, well, you had like 1,000 teachers. It's like, well, okay, that's fair. And I like that perspective of like, you picked up 1,000 different things from different places. But yeah, traditionally, coming out of high school, the Savannah College of Art and Design representatives would go around to schools in the area.
Yeah.
And sorry, my phone. I'm going to take my watch off real quick because it is exploding. Feels weird when you don't have something on.
Oh, I know, right? You're always looking at.
Yeah, it's like it's 10 pounds lighter now. I thought I was going to go to SCAD in Savannah because it has a beautiful Petter Hall, and their whole MO is to like buy old buildings and refurnish them and restore them, and it's incredible. It's all very impressive. And then I learned the cost per semester, and I was like, nope, there's no way. I mean, to that point, I've been playing with graphics really since I'd say probably middle school. So when I was 13 or 14, I learned about Maya Personal Learning Edition.
Oh, I remember.
Which I think was like way back, right?
That's old school.
Yeah, now we get to feel old, even though I still feel like, I'm still 19. I'm making games. It's
Yeah,
Fountain of
yeah.
Youth. But yeah, I remember seeing this. You'll know this. The screensavers on Tech TV with Patrick Norton and Leo Laporte. They had on a representative from Alias Wavefront at the time. They were demoing Maya,
Yeah.
and I remember they drew a spline of like a chess pawn, and they revolved it into a full shape, and then they
the
like pulled it
classic.
above
Yeah.
yeah. They just, here's how you can do it real quick, and they gave it gravity, and then it fell on the plane and bounced around, and that's when like my head exploded, and I was like, I want to do that, like whatever that is. I want to, make images in the computer. And kind of in tandem with that, I had been interested in digital photography. I was no good at it. I mean, I was a teenager. I didn't know anything yet, but I liked using cameras and I liked using computers. And so really in middle school going into high school, that was kind of my own personal punch me in the face if I'm rambling, by the way.
No.
I tend to tangentialize everything.
Go for it, buddy.
But yeah, really, oh, that's what it was. Kind of the education part. Yeah. So I had the interest. Like I grew up with Legos, so my brain needs to be making something at all times, or like I go insane. I'm kind of like a border collie in that sense. I will tear up the carpet if there's nothing to be creating. And my wife loves that, by the way. But yeah, middle school into high school is really learning the ins and outs of how a camera sees the world. It was a terrible Sony Digicam that wrote to like floppy disk. So it would take like 20 seconds to save a JPEG, and it's like 1 megapixel. And I don't have the project anymore because it was uploaded to DeviantArt a long time ago, and my account's been gone. But the thing that really put me in the mindset was like, okay, I have this crappy camera, and we have an old basketball gym at my high school that no one uses. Mm-hmm. And it had these really, I thought, I think any lighting artist would think kind of ugly yellow painted glass windows are beautiful because it makes the whole, space monochromatically amber. And so I took this terrible camera during graphic arts class, and I just photographed everything. Not to any standard. This wasn't PBR. This was just like, I'm taking a picture. Yes, the reflections are baked in. What did I know? But I photographed the whole thing, and then I basically, over like months, I think junior into senior year, I just spent time learning, the simple modeling tools and booleans and extrusions, all the basic stuff in Maya. But image-based kind of texture projection onto, the geometry that represented it. And ultimately I ended up with a really terrible, but, best effort version of the old gym mapped with actual photographs of it. And I did get to the point where I could get the yellow windows to inject light into Final Gather and Mental Ray to actually light the space. And that was when I was like, okay, there's something to like this digital lighting,
and dude,
thing, and it was
that
fun.
Technique as well. Like the UK was very, very well known for racing game developers. A lot of them have closed down over the years. There's still a few around, and there's a few popping back up actually now. But that technique, taking photographs, projecting it onto basic geometry, and just extruding in and out, yeah, that fundamental stuff is still really important today, just to keep the skills up in the environment on. But yeah, I remember that. It's like, yeah, you take a picture and there's a cup in the window and you're mirroring the window everywhere. It's like, oh, there's the same cup like in the same 10 windows, but we didn't know what we were doing, did we? We were just like, yeah, it looks cool, put it in there. So,
yeah, and you look at, oh yeah, and you look at pivotal movies like The Matrix in 1999, where the whole foundation of their environment rendering was photogrammetric approaches with real world recovered surfaces and BDRF shaders and all of that. That it's amazing that everything that ESC Digital and Manex was doing at the time, half of those people like run Epic Games these days. By the way, their whole tech team is like all the people that created the technology for the Matrix. But it's so fun that like everything that was happening in the film industry would eventually be done, you know, at 4K, 60 frames per second at 33 milliseconds, which is 16 milliseconds for 60 FPS. Yeah. How it's all come full circle.
So, speaking about fundamentals, and we start to dive into the lighting side of it, I have some notes, and I recall, I'm going to paraphrase you, but you're very big on fundamentals. So I believe you said a few years ago when you had that other talk, animators, they looked at the first cave paintings and they were almost like benchmarks of keyframe poses, right? And you said that's really important. Knowing your history and going back is really important. Now, I was a teacher for 6 years. I taught environment art and lighting, and one of the common things students hated was the fundamentals and history, and what they liked most was the modeling. But they're kind of modeling with no substance behind it. They're just modeling kind of what they see, not understanding why they see it. And for sure, you'd have a selection of students that would be into the art history and fundamentals, but the glamorous side of the modeling, the high poly, the baking, all that sort of stuff, it does take over a lot of time. So what sort of led you to go back and sort of look at the fundamentals? And if animators were looking at cave paintings as their first origin, as an example, what do you think lighters could look at? What's their cave painting as a benchmark for lighting?
That is the coolest question I've ever been asked. This is like the hot ones of artist interviews. You went and you actually watched something. That's terrifying.
Yeah, dude, I love podcasts. I love this sort of stuff. I just love the knowledge. So, but yeah, what's the cave painting of lighting, and how your principal level? So you're at the top level of a game art field, and you're big on fundamentals. So what can people learn from that if they're maybe not so much into it at the moment?
The biggest lesson, and again, you know, these are obviously just my opinions of my own, you know, kind of experience. And I totally encourage people to find, you know, their own way of kind of seeing. We're obviously talking about light specifically, but in any art, like, how do you see it? How do you interpret it? What do you kind of like about it? The journey that I went on was like, I launched right into digital lighting. I had familiarity with the mechanics of photography and general rules for like exposure. I didn't really know what that meant for how to like author that, you know, from scratch. I didn't understand those relationships yet. I didn't know that there was an absolute relationship between EV and nits and candela and lux and all that, how those are all just the same, just with different terms. So for me, it was a lot of like, okay, my digital lighting is not that strong. And actually, funny enough, and I just sent him a message, but the former art director, I hope he doesn't mind me name dropping him. I don't know him personally. I just remember the feedback he gave me, which he didn't have to, and he did it for free. When I applied to Ready at Dawn years ago, when they're kind of in their prime, this is right after they released the Order 1886, which is phenomenal. Yeah. And it's like a love letter to every craft that went into it. But the art director at the time, Nathan, personally responded to my application, was like, hey, we're not going to move forward. I'm deeply paraphrasing, but you know, here's what we're looking for, and here's how you're kind of missing the mark. Here's what we would expect to see compared to what you've shown us, right? The exposure isn't behaving what we'd expect. Like, these don't seem photometric. This isn't kind of what light would do here. And so that was like, okay, I have the baby steps grasp on lighting, but I'm not, I mean, I still don't think I'm quite there, but you know, everything's still a work in progress. But you know, basically it's a long way of saying, I went back to like, okay, let's put digital tools on pause for a minute. What were they doing hundreds of years ago? Cool. And then that sent me into the rabbit hole of Johannes Vermeer, which is a personal favorite because by all accounts he was kind of, you know, a painterly tech artist at the time. He there's a really great documentary called Tim's Vermeer. I don't know if it's still on Netflix, but it's about the CEO of the Lightwave. I think it's Lightwave software.
Oh,
I'm
I
mistaken.
remember Lightwave. I used to use it.
Yeah, I believe if it's not Lightwave, it's a different package. But the CEO of that company wanted to recreate. He wanted to replicate Johannes Vermeer kind of camera obscura process and see if he could recreate, you know, Girl with the Pearl Earring and all the classics. And he did. He even figured out, spoiler alert, at the end of the documentary, he figures it out, and it's pretty awesome. He even figured out like there should be a roof line outside of the windows this far away, and the steeples are this tall to create this kind of shadow. Like he got deep into the science of it. But you know, the Vermeer was his process basically turned humans into an organic renderer. That if you a progressive renderer, that if you sat there long enough, you know, flipping the mirror up and down to kind of look at your reference image, which was the real thing, and if you painted long enough and spent long enough on it, you would get something that was very photographic because all of your paint decisions were driven by light of a real scene, right? You're not looking at it and translating it, you're literally matching like the actual light and the hues there. So I looked at Caravaggio. I started looking at other. I started paying way deeper attention to my favorite movies and why I liked them, what their visual appeal was. One of my favorite directors of photography is Wally Pfister, who did he did the Dark Knight trilogy with Christopher Nolan. He's not afraid to have a lot of the frame just be jet black and it just falls away and there's no information. I love that. To me, that feels not that I don't think I necessarily copied that, but it reaffirmed my like, yeah, that is my own sensibility. I love black as editorial in the frame. Like if you don't need to see it, then just don't show it.
We've that's an interesting one as well, because for games
you want to be able to see it for
I've worked
gameplay.
on a horror game, and even after we upped the brightness because it was still too dark, once we released, most of the players upped the brightness even further. So do you think that jet black is maybe something that works a little bit more in cinematics but not so much gameplay? Is that an accessibility sort of thing we have to manage with?
Yeah, I mean, in a practical sense, you know, we can't, you know, we use industry standard calibrated displays. We adhere to SDR and HDR kind of viewing environments. All the nerdy underpinning of like, here's your viewing environment. This is how bright it must be. You know, you always want to try to satisfy the base like technical readability. Because yeah, in a playtest, someone's gonna raise their hand and just be like, "I don't know where I'm going. I can't see anything."
Yeah.
And it's like, well, that's a problem because now, you know, your artistic intent is fighting. Can people even use this? And if they can't, they're not going to tell their friends about it. They're definitely not going to give you $60 to play it. And that's a problem. Yeah. So that is definitely. That's kind of like a never-ending struggle, right? Of like, hey,
it is.
Don't we like this contrast? It looks really good. Yeah, but no one can see anything.
Yeah, they're just going to turn the brightness up. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, I'm so glad to hear you say that, because I've been through exactly that with horror, where you kind of want to try and go super dark, like the movies, which kind of brings me into my next thing. So you're speaking about how you're going back and you're seeing how, you know, this CEO of Lightwave, or if it was Lightwave, is recreating the exact science, and you going back 100 years. And all that sort of stuff. I guess that's why I believe that you don't look at, when you're lighting, I guess commercially or maybe personally as well, you don't look at games because you're so
No.
into that history. But also, I think when you look at games, and I say this all the time with environment art, you look at what other people have iterated on for hundreds of decisions. Whereas with movies and concept art or paintings, you can interpret that yourself as a games visual artist. So is that also the reason why you don't look at games? And is that a strict rule? Do you look at games sometimes, or do you find that it's just going to manipulate what you see in your head because you're going to go that direction?
Oh my God. So I'm grinning ear to ear because that exact idea of what you just expressed with different words is, I've never been able to articulate it quite as profoundly as you just did, but absolutely for the same reason. Because so my perspective, if you, not to, I don't want it to sound like it's a superiority thing. Like, no, I don't study games. Yeah. Screw the rest of you. What do you know? My perspective and what I learned when I did try to emulate, copy for, when you reverse engineer something, you try to do it so that you can try to understand, oh, this might have been what they did. My perspective is, if you copy a game, if you try to copy anything, even, movie lighting or whatever it is, paintings, your own Polaroids, doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. But specific to games, if you try to copy the end result of a shipped game, you are emulating what they were able to get away with after 1,000 iterations of what they were not able to do.
100%.
And so you are completely abstracted from, the input inspiration, what they were looking at, right? So they're and I know everyone loves Roger Deakins, but like, let's say some of their starting frames were like stills from Skyfall or No Country for Old Men or whatever it is. It's like, yeah, let's start with Roger Deakins, but you ship something that's just inherently, all of it's 50% gray and it's all overcast. It's like, well, why did they do that? Because players were complaining that they couldn't see, enemy snipers in the tree line, and so we had to change the weather and flatten it. It's like, well, that looks nothing like Deakins. It's like, well, that's game development.
Yeah, accessibility.
We had to make it visible. Exactly. But yeah, no. So my reference, I always like to look at. I try to start at the highest end anything can be, and in my opinion, that is photography of real light. Just because to me, that's like, of course, if you make it look, if you can do the glance test, which is you have a shot of the project on a monitor across the room, if you can glance at it and back, and you're like, wow, that's a nice photo, then that's a pretty good, test.
Right, I didn't know that.
I totally made that up. That's not a thing.
I'm doing the glance test. I feel like what's that film, Zoolander?
Zoolander, yeah. If you can hit it with blue steel and it's convincing, then I think that's a good, place to start. But
okay.
if you break it down, even those two shots that you have up here of Back for Blood, this interior, this was baked lighting with CPU light mask, which I learned was actually bleeding off like 30% of the energy. So it was actually baking darker than it should have been. I only learned that after we shipped the project, but these are the things you learn.
Yeah, that's very common because we had a few levels on UD, not many, that were CPU light mask, and it's like you always have to make your lights in a baked workflow something like 50% brighter because they will get darker in the baking process.
Yeah, just the encoding of the light map textures and the MIP and how big it is, how much indirect light you could actually save onto it. If it's like 16 pixels, then most of that is like a fuzzy MIP boundary that's darker anyway. It's a lot.
2022, you were baking here. This type of lighting, so I'm looking at the this and the T-Rex. When I look at stuff like this, I'm like, okay, if I was in Unreal and I press G, how many lights would I see? Or is it literally just a skylight and a directional light? Like, what is happening behind the scenes with, bear in mind this is baked, so it
Yes.
does change a little bit of stuff in terms of dynamic, which we'll get into. But I guess if this was, what is it like baked? And if it was going to be dynamic in 2025, would you have less lights? So what's the general, how do you get a look like this basically?
If I remember this, I remember that we had fairly restricted exposure ranges on Back for Blood. We didn't allow the Tonemapper to kind of swing up and down because it tends to give people kind of motion sickness.
Oh,
and if you don't understand what you're seeing, then it felt kind of weird. So it would be pretty controlled. But to that end, that meant that, okay, the outside environment, and it's all one continuous playthrough. Like you come outside, you come inside, I think you end on the interior.
okay.
But this entire interior was basically jet black, without the lighting pass. The outside, the exterior kind of took care of itself. So I like the prompt. What are some tips for lighting interiors without light fixtures? In cases like that, I just try to absolutely respect the motivation for where the light's coming from is absolutely shaped by what's there. So in the case of the skylight at the top left of the first shot, I want to say there is an array of something like however many scallops there are of the mullions between the panes of glass. Basically, each pane of glass I would give its own area light, and that would be duplicated into an array. And because it's baking, the calculation is going to run at the same time anyway. But I wanted, I just tried to respect as close as I can in my mind of how the physics works. Like, if there was a toroidal skylight in this room, and maybe the exposure were just set a little bit higher in the room, more kind of in-person perceptual natural instead of just photoreal where it's like really slam contrast. Kind of what would that look like? And so you have a big donut light made of a bunch of smaller ones keying the room. And then the only bit of real sunlight that makes it in are kind of the harder hits you see landing on the blue tile below. That is actually the directional light, but it's not really contributing much of anything. And all the rest of that is just, I want to say there were, because it would have been a hand place reflection volume 2, and there are probably like 6 of them in this room, and a spherical one just below the main window to get that round reflection influence. But I try to think of it, at least the exercise I step through is like, how a lot of special effects in kind of 1980s, early 1990s movies would be miniatures on, a table, something that could fit in your garage. And they would kind of have to miniaturize, well, they literally did use smaller lighting rigs on the models to make it look larger scale, like their actual location photography. I would use a similar mindset. I still do for, interiors. Like if this were like a model on my desk and I wanted it to look big, like an actual location, putting kind of paper towel diffusion on a small like flashlight to blur it to get me kind of the overcast look. But it would be a similar mindset of a real director of photography who would choose different light sources for their quality of light, for hard or soft shadows. They would dial in the colors, use big hanging sheets of muslin diffusion to soften shadows.
I guess in a way then, which ties me into the physically accurate. If this was, let's say it's dynamic, let's just say for argument's sake, Lumen, would you still...
And now megalights, don't forget those.
Megalights, yeah.
Soon.
Yeah, which will be amazing, by the way, if we can actually use all those lights. Would you still... let's get into like physical accuracy. So if we were going to do dynamic PBL for this scene and it wasn't baked, would that change the placement of your lights, or would you still? Well, you can't really use that many area lights dynamically, right? So, would you use one without mega lights? With 10 mega lights, isn't
Yeah.
it? How would you recreate that in a PBL dynamic? Because I'm thinking, a skylight, a directional light, and then maybe a big, almost like a big spotlight going into the inside. But what would you do with a principal level? You would know the way or a good approach for it.
I honestly tend to be somewhat of. Please don't tell my employers this. I try to be as lazy of an artist as possible to add as few. I try to make as few global affecting decisions as I can to get the biggest visual result. So that also just helps economically with runtime performance and overdraw and stuff.
Yeah.
At least if we're talking, well, let's extrapolate it forward a little bit to the future example of megalights and Lumen fully dynamic. From the testing I've done, if this is, let's say EV5, maybe EV4 as an interior exposure. Let's say it's 5. It's a little bit brighter interior. If this is EV5, we have an outdoor overcast, photometric values plugged in. From what I've seen with Lumen and being able to control kind of the sample quality, it wouldn't look exactly like this because with the, as you pointed out with the baked approach, it's kind of more like painting with light in a volumetric sense because you don't have to worry about that runtime. You can kind of, and I'll have this bank here and we'll kick this corner up because it's kind of dark. With the dynamic approach, I would try to rely more on exposure to reveal all the lighting data that happens there in Lumen. And I'd, key it up as needed or use exposure compensation, maybe push it a stop to get to this kind of bed, right? And then, with megalights, if I really wanted that specific dappling, I would maybe sync a couple of area lights just to give a little extra liveness to the reflections of materials, especially around the mezzanine. But truly, my initial take would be, okay, directional light with a high shape radius or source radius, sorry, to soften the direct shadows. Skylight adjusted in kind. Set your key exposure of where you want the interior to be. See what that gets you, and then really go from there. And then just add as few helpers as you need in the scene to lift the rest of it up.
Okay. So because one thing I guess that is not too possible with Lumen is when you do have fake lights that are in the world, and a player runs through it. That's tough. Like you can get away with that with lighting channels, but I believe you have to correct me if I'm wrong on this, Scott. But I believe lighting channels in Lumen don't work 100% or don't work at all. There's some sort of caveat to using lighting channels, like something like the you can use them, but the baked like lighting, not the baked lighting, the screen space effects of it. Still, there's something with lighting channels and Lumen that I've heard is not as usable as it once was, but I'm not sure if you know much about that or.
I haven't. I have to admit, I haven't played too much with the lighting channel side in Lumen. But from what I've seen, it does seem to work more like as a master pass. Like it's either there affecting everything uniformly or it's not, depending on if you did like custom stenciling on skeletal meshes or something, you could work it in. But at least from how I've been working lately and doing new R&D, it's been really just working in a master sense, kind of one global layer affecting everything. Basically. Exactly. And I prefer that. Yeah.
No, sorry.
Oh, no, sorry.
No, please continue.
No, you go. As much as I can, I try to light things in a holistic pass. Like if there's a light source, it is in the world, it's going to have an effect. That's actually where the light is coming from, baked or dynamic. And obviously with dynamic currently, you can, only afford so much radius because the current renderer is classic deferred, which will burn up overdraw very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
But with megalights, it's like, you can have 50 lights in here just fine.
Dude, yeah, it's gonna be amazing. One thing I've noticed as well, I think maybe on the Unreal team are aware of this, and they keep adding extra controls for local exposure, is that more and more there are tools that allow you to tackle interiors without trying to do too much with exposure. So I believe there's skylight leaking, which is a slider, and there's also local exposure shadows, a slider as well. And I believe recently in either 5.4 or 5.5 from one of the older versions, they changed the default value from local exposure shadow contrast from 1 to 0.8, which you just find that stuff out randomly, right? It's like, oh, the default value's changed, by the way. So I think, I guess a normal critique of Unreal is that it's too contrasty. So everyone always tries to uncontrast it. So it seems as though Unreal are slowly adding more controls to get rid of that sort of typical aces look. So,
the 1.3 tone map is aggressive, and that's true if you've used it on video and in Resolve. The first Lego movie, I believe was done with ASUS 1.01, I think, because it had a heavy yellow bias, which actually worked really well for yellow Lego people. Super aggressive. Like that toe just drops down to an event horizon, which is, you can work with that, but if you leave it alone and you don't, use things like local highlight control and just kind of duck down and reveal highlights a little bit more, you have to kind of light under it to rebalance it, which means you're injecting more light energy than you really need to. And now you have more light actors simply to fight a tone map versus just adjust the tone mapping at the start and then, make lighting decisions under it.
So that's why you'll see, I guess, some people mess with those controls. When people say, oh, Unreal's so contrasty, it's because of that sort of curve that everyone deals with. Which kind of leads me into...
But that's when you...
Sorry, yeah. No.
Oh, no, sorry. I didn't mean to jump on you. But that's when you... I think that's when you kind of, at the start in pre-production, I find that's when those big decisions kind of happen, is like, okay, we want a more naturalistic bed of maybe we don't want... And I'm speaking to an HDR workflow, which you see a lot of things in HDR now that you just can't see in SDR because you get 100 nits. That's it. And anything above it, it's just invisible to you. But in the context of lighting in native HDR, as an example, you can... Big shit, what we call really contrasty. So these are SDR screenshots, obviously, because I didn't. Back 4 Blood was monitored in HDR, but it was not lit in HDR from day one, which it would look very different if we had done that approach. But nowadays, if you start a project in HDR, even the ASUS 1.3 transform, if you see it on an HDR display, you can absolutely see the detail in the highlights and the detail in the shadows at the same time, right? And that's just the benefit of having that extra luminance information. And then the minute you move it to SDR, it looks crunchy again and kind of really high contrast. But that kind of frees you up to, instead of making necessarily lighting art decisions to fix that, it just becomes a technical decision of, okay, we don't like how crunchy SDR is. Okay, cool. We'll just affect the tone map for it separately than what we're doing in HDR. And your lighting path stays the same. So it opens up a lot of really cool ways of working, really.
You just, before I hop to the Call of Duty thing, you've just unlocked a memory for me, which... HDR. So let's say you got a lighting team. Studio Bob, we'll call them. Studio Bob has 4 remote lighting artists in different parts of the world. They've all got different monitors. some say they have HDR, like it's in Windows, but none of them have a expensive HDR monitor, and they're asked to try and work in a HDR workflow, and they're maybe debating, oh yeah, I have HDR on Windows, and someone else like, no, you don't have you need at least 1,000 nits or this and that. HDR is very confusing. I don't understand it completely. I don't really know how you can work with it in a team, especially remote. I don't know if a monitor needs to be 1,000 nits, 600 nits. I don't know what happens when you turn HDR on, when a monitor has 400 nits, what is it actually doing? Can you at least demystify? I know it's super technical and you do a lot of HDR stuff. Demystify ELI 5 almost to me. What is HDR? What are the nits for a monitor? How could you work with it without HDR monitors? Do you need HDR monitors? I'm a blank slate with HDR. I'd love to know more.
So the main thing, okay, so I'm sure you've heard of like Dolby Vision, the Dolby Vision spec for HDR, which allows from 0 to 10,000 nits of peak luminance, which is insane because if you flashbang yourself with a monitor pegged to 1,000 nits with a white screen, it's painful enough in the dark. But so the one thing I have learned from one of the very smart people I get to work with at Worlds Untold is the nit kind of plateaus, the nit range mezzanines, if you will, are truly just there more for current display capability. They're not technically part of like the HDR spec itself. The spec is you have a signal, a PQ signal that can go 0 to 10,000. Now, most consumer stuff can't show that. I think there are like 2 or 3 displays in the world that can hit 10,000. And they're like hundreds of thousands of dollars. So it's not, and they like burn up and they need cooling. Like it's not practical yet, but presumably the tech will get further along every year. So the nit levels, you have the VESA display consortium, and you have, there's a subclass for OLEDs versus LED, backlit LEDs, because those can typically go brighter, but they're not as great in the shadows. OLEDs are great for like infinite shadow precision, but they can't hit the peak highlights because OLEDs are organic and you can't overdrive them the same without damaging them. So that doesn't help that there's like different hardware capability, but basically there is one HDR container, 0 to 10,000, and depending on your viewing device and depending on where you plan to ship it, you would kind of monitor at those plateaus. So 1,000 is the current. It's not standard because again, it's not technically part of the standard. It's more like a restriction for now of how much can we show of it. That would actually a convenient enough SIG is when you're using physically based values. So like you use 120,000 lux on the sun. Obviously internally, that's going to light off to the raw linear value is, the raw pixel value gets really, really high, and you're never going to show that even in HDR. But if you're talking about future proofing, right, the sun signal is still, depending on the material it's illuminating, it's still approaching like 10,000 and beyond. So the work of the Tonemapper's job is to say, okay, I have this really insanely bright signal. And where are you going to display me on? Okay, cool. This Tonemapper is going to walk me down to 1,000. And so internally, you still have literally 1,000 to 1 contrast ratio. But it has been it's been range compressed to what your display can actually do. And that's what really nice TVs like the LG OLEDs and the Sony Bravias or whatever, they can do that calculation internally, but because you can't control where it's going to be seen, like the videos I export from Resolve, I'll just export them in 1,000 nit container. So it can scale, brighter, but you won't physically see any more detail in those 1000 nit highlights. Just like SDR is parked at 100, if you display 100 nit content in a 1000 nit container, you've just made your clipped white point 1000 nits instead of 100. But there's no physical additional information in the highlights versus if it had actually been authored at 1000 or 10,000. There's a lot of stuff I can't say about it specifically because secret sauce.
Would you say would you say if someone was looking to get into HDR on a PC monitor, they'd be wanting to look for something that is it HDR 1000? Is that what they're referred to, or something that's 1000 nits as a standard, or?
So I would. The monitor that I use is an Asus PA32 UCX. It's not exactly cheap, but it is something of the Rolls Royce of current, HDR authoring for video and for games. And what's neat is that the panel is, I think its VESA rating is HDR 1600, but physically, from what my calibration probe tells me, it will actually hit 2000 nits.
Oh.
So, and it's very painful when it does. But technically, it's already future-proof for okay, all consumer TVs can do 2000 nits now. And then developers ship a patch for their game that unlocks the next, range of brightness rendering, and now you can see it. But yeah, the thing that I like about it, I describe it as the window effect, is so the main thing, there's so much to say about HDR. We could spend the hour just talking about
it's cool.
HDR.
I guess
to me,
the main takeaways from it is it's super complex, and there are technical teams behind all this. But if someone wanted to see all the juice in their own monitor, they would want something like what you mentioned, or somewhere close to 1000 nits potentially.
It's getting better. So, to your earlier question of what happens if you display something encoded at 1000 nits on an OLED that's only rated for HDR 400, then the hardware at that point will say, "Oh crap, this is 1000. We can't do that. We're going to range compress it internally in hardware live to where we can show it." And so, anything below that point, it just does hardware scaling of the signal.
Okay.
In a good device. But yeah, I'd say Asus keeps coming out. They're not the only brand, of course, but they're the one I have the most experience with. But the biggest thing is with any kind of HDR display, OLED is great, but it just can't hit the peaks. And also one kind of last point about HDR, it's not, a lot of people focus on how bright can we make things. It's do you seriously just want to represent a sunlit, snowy environment at 4000 nits for the whole game? You don't need to do that. So what it allows, a lot of people focus on the highlight overrange, and it is stunning. Truly, when you see what am I trying to say? When you see a purposefully authored HDR signal next to an SDR signal embedded in it, because PQ is absolute, so you can actually stick SDR right in it, and it's accurate. I liken it to, there is looking at an oil painting someone made of the view out the window, and then there is physically looking out the window of that actual view.
Okay, yeah.
When you see them, a lot of people haven't seen it. In my experience, a lot of people, it's like a religion or a legend or something, right? I've heard of it. I've heard of HDR. I know what it is intellectually, but they have never seen, here's your art authored for HDR. Here it is in SDR. Which one do you want to buy?
I've never seen it.
Everyone picks HDR.
A bunch of folks I've worked with, because those type of monitors are $2,000 as well.
They get pricey quickly, and that's because of the resolution of the micro backlights, and it will come down in cost as manufacturers can spin more of them out over time, but it's still pretty cutting edge stuff.
Dude, I cannot wait. The time I get HDR and I see the line, I'm like, geez, that's.
I don't want to go back. Like even with with my stills photos, instead of like exporting to Flickr or anything anymore, which cannot show HDR. Funny enough, Adobe is one of the few companies actually focusing on HDR sharing in a very simple way. I can just export straight to a web folder online. And if you use, it has to be Chrome and it has to be on an HDR enabled, you know, whatever your OS is. And you can just see it. And if I make an edit in Lightroom, it goes straight out to the album. And so it pains me, the notion of, no, this photo in HDR looks exactly like the sunrise looked to me in person. And if I crunch it down to SDR, it feels like going to 8mm film in, you know, the 70s. I have 8K HDR now at 60 frames per second. I'm not going back to the postage stamp
I've
dynamic
never seen
range.
it, so like a lot of us don't have a point of reference for that. But as soon as we do in the future, it's gonna be awesome. But there's one thing I probably want to loop round to. Probably something I haven't done too much of yet. I think it's that harder side of lighting. So it's the whole notion of physically based lighting. So I don't know how long this has been around, I guess, over there in let's see, the West. I don't know, like I'm in the East now, I'm in the UK, but a lot of the folks I've worked with, including myself, we've only really in the last year or so started to see PBL and what it means and what the values are, like the EV100. When did this start to come into games? Because you can go back not even like a few years and someone would say PBL, you know, we're just using these types of values anyway. It seems as though PBL, this is like a hot term that it's come in somewhere. Now we're all aware of it and we're all learning it. We're still getting there with it and using the right exposure values and lights and how to go with it. But when did you think that came in? Like, when did you start hearing about PBL and maybe even working in it commercially? Where do you think it came from? Like, who kicked? There's someone somewhere that kicked it off. There's a lighting artist god somewhere that kicked off PBL, and now, like, because I've heard of it, I don't know where it came from, and it's based on real world and photography, but how it came to games specifically, there's some time over the last few years for the UK, I feel. But when did you start going into this PBL system and all that sort of stuff?
So the earliest, I know Paul DeBevic at USC Berkeley at the ICT lab, him and his team created the original synthetic HDR for offline rendering, I think in 1997. And then that was basically, he had these examples. I think you can go to debevic.org and you can literally see the timeline of everything he's contributed, which is like HDR, photogrammetry, performance relighting of spatially captured humans. Like, and now he works at Netflix at their Eyeline studios, reinventing everything again. It's amazing. They had this beautiful Parthenon short where they laser scanned the Parthenon on top of the Acropolis in Greece and lit it with an HDR time-lapse sequence captured in California, which, like, it's so cool. It's, that institution is amazing. But so the rendering of it, the synthesis of it was in 97. And then I think in the early 2000s, I remember, and he had the beautiful demo rendering with natural light, which is still a gorgeous looking little render. ATI released a real-time version of it as a demo for the Radeon cards. I want to say sometime between 2005. And that's when I was familiar with high dynamic range images. Of like, oh, what's this? Oh, well, it's combined exposures of a light field. It's like, okay, what do you do with it? Well, you plug it in the renderer and it spits out light and reflections of the real thing. It's like, okay, cool. And then it kind of paused for a few years, at least from what I had seen. And I'd used a few game engines, but my exposure to it in a production environment was when I was working at Raven and I worked on my first Call of Duty, which was World War II and Modern Warfare 2 Remaster. But Sledgehammer, at the time, we were using the S2 engine, which is every main studio, at least back then, I think they've all unified to one Call of Duty engine these days, but we were using Sledgehammer's branch, which was called S2. And it was completely calibrated to physical units. Like it expected lux, it used EV and post volumes and stuff. And Atsushi Seo was the lighting director at the time. And I remember this internal presentation. I can talk about it because I'm not sharing it, but there was an internal demo that I think the lighting team at Sledgehammer, they took like a hallway in their studio in reality, and they used iconic light meters, and they sampled all the emergency lights and the fluorescent lights in the stairwell, and they sampled materials, and then they went and rebuilt the hallway in the Call of Duty editor, and it was 1-to-1 with like, here's the game render, here's reality, and it's just perfect. That's when it clicked for me in a visual sense of, okay, cool, all this stuff from photography that's been knocking around in your head, now you have a way to like apply it, and this is what it means. So when we would shoot, because a lot of the skies in World War II, especially in the labor camp in Remagen, we actually photographed those in fields in Madison, Wisconsin. So the game is lit in the overcast ones by light from Wisconsin, not from Germany.
Nice.
But you know, it's overcast. Overcast happens everywhere in the world. We just need the EV of it, which we got. But I think if I remember, that external environment was EV9. It was pretty dim. It was a dark, overcast day, but that was the exterior. And then, you know, the interior, you kind of set it where you like it. Then all of your local, you could get as nerdy with it as you want. Like, you know, obviously I prefer that. I just like knowing the starting point is correct. So if you had a Jeep or something and it's sitting there in the scene with its brake lamps on, I would prefer to, well, this is the meter I use for incident readings because I have the flat hemisphere dome, the L308XU. And literally, if I just turn it on, but you can't see it, but right now it's reading an EV. Is that focusing? I can't tell.
It's a bit blurred. Oh,
There we go.
3.6?
3.6 EVs. So actually, it's 4.7. I just got the right measurement. Come on, Sony. There we go. So that's just reading where I'm sitting using the flat dome. Where I'm sitting is 4.7 EVs. And back in the day, what I would do is break out a gray card, hold it here, spot meter it for absolute candela, which you can do. Candela and nits are the same unit. So if I'm reading the gray card and it's like, I don't know, 100 nits, I would then look up in the EV chart, what's the absolute relationship between the brightness of this gray and what does that say the EV should be? Oh, it's EV 4.7. As an example, those numbers are not accurate. But now, you know, we would shoot the HDR, you would take the light meter, measure it. If the sun was out, okay, the sun is, say it's a sunny day, 16 EV, what's the shadow? We're reading 10 EV, cool. That's everything you need to, you have the HDRI of what you photographed, you have the exposure ranges where it needs to sit, you plug it all in, you've satisfied middle gray, and then you make the creative decisions of maybe we pull exposure compensation by 2 stops to make it feel, you know, darker, or maybe we push it to make it more hopeful. But yeah, truly Call of Duty was like, for me, the finishing school of here's, I mean, the world's largest game production still is, just using straight up, you know, lighting science and real values as normal as everyday decision making. And it was so cool. And it broke my decision making, by the way. I refuse, within reason, if I can avoid it, I only prefer to work on projects that use PBL.
Okay, interesting. Would you recommend every lighting artist have a light meter in their bag?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. What's a good one? What's a good affordable one you reckon for the video?
So, I mean, there are different levels of it. Like this is a Seaconic L308X-U, and brand new, it's about 250. You can find them used all over eBay. It's
That's
gonna do
nothing.
the same thing.
It's going to last your career, so that's not a
Yeah,
bad investment at all. Okay.
it takes 2 AA batteries. It's great. Set it to ISO 100 because that's literally the whole base of EV 100 references.
Yeah.
And again, there's nothing wrong with, I have my other light meter back there. There's nothing wrong with metering luminance off of a gray card. I just like this because it's one object that I can hold.
Yeah.
And so my lamp right here, that's 5.2. What's the facing wall? 3.8. So I could just plug that. You could even, and I don't totally advocate for this, but if you didn't even want to worry about absolute local values and local intensities, like I don't want to worry about the actual candela of the side of my face. I just want to know that it's for EV. Okay, cool. So you can place your gray cube here in Unreal, set your light intensity to where the spot meter reads out EV4, and you have hit that physical intensity. You're done. You can just worry about one number. Where that gets tricky though is while you can think about things just in terms of EV, and Unreal definitely allows you to work that way now, I still think it's useful for people. My other Seaconic gives me a spot meter that'll read out candela luminance, I think up to like 1 million. Which if you're pointing at something 1 million candela, you're going to have problems. That's a lot of light.
Sun.
That's 1.3 billion nits, which you will never represent on a monitor without killing anyone sitting in front of it. But if you're recreating a car in the engine and you want to recreate the brightness of the brake lamp LEDs between park and brake applied, you want to measure the absolute luminance. And then let's say when you're just parked, brake lamp's 100 candela, you hit the brake, 1,000 candela. Cool. So in Unreal, with your virtual spot meter again, you would set that red material to 100 nits. When it's parked, when the brake applied, you just calibrate it to where it reads out 1,000. And physically, that is exactly the real behavior of the brake lamp in the engine. And glow and bloom will respond, as you would expect it to and all that.
Is there any way to make, so when you talk about the thing in Unreal, are you talking about the you go to show HDRI adaptation, that little?
Yes. Yeah.
Is there a way to make that font bigger? Because I swear to God, bro, that font, I can't see shit.
It's like, what is this, a light meter for ants? It's like a 4-point font. I don't know why they did it, but I did ask an engineer recently if we could fix that. Apparently, it's an engine-wide font, and so if you change that, it will knock on a lot of other tools. Epic, if you're listening, please God, make that like 12-point font on the tool at a minimum. Please, just make it bigger.
Yeah, because that's a newer thing. I've been doing a bit recently. You make the 18% gray cube, which is 50% or something like that, and you put a cube on a cube and you point your directional light at it or whatever, and you hover it over the shadow and you hover it over the light. That's something I've started doing recently.
Yep.
Is that stuff you do a lot of the time in commercial work, or is your eye just so trained at this point that you can kind of see it?
Oh, it's I always want to know that it's technically correct under the hood, right? Because it's kind of hard, especially when you have exposure adaptation on top of it. It's hard to look at like a gray sphere and be like, yeah, that's 120,000 lux, I promise. So that's when I break out the spot. I want to actually know. I don't use the lux meter, the top portion of it, because it's kind of weird right now in 5.4, but I do use the absolute. I'll either use the EV readout because it'll read out EV and candela at the same time.
Yeah.
So depending on what mood I am, if I have an existing measurement that I took, I don't know, in Puerto Rico, I'll pull that up and plug that in based off of the gray luminance. Otherwise, I could just go to the top of our building and get a quick reference of oh yeah, the sunset is actually combined. Everything is still like EV8, and you would think it would be darker than that. But yeah, it just depends. Like if you're doing, I don't know, if you wanted to do integration of a CG object in a real background plate, then I'd probably do an actual gray sphere that I could actually meter, in the same places as the virtual reference. So that I know when it's next to my headphones, it's getting exactly the same energy as the real light, and then you shoot a little HDRI and go to town.
Keep a note of that. That's perfect. Speaking of exposure, hovering over Call of Duty World War II. If I remember correctly, you said that your approach for this is you expose for the outside, and the insides were, I think, voids of darkness, is what you said. In today's workflows, well, you said they're voids of darkness, and you light them inside to bring the lightness up with fake lights. In today's workflow of PBL and dynamic, would you expose for the outside, and instead of fake lighting the inside, would you be the quote unquote lazy lighter, which is the correct lighter, and bring that inside up with tools like skylight leaking and local exposure, so you don't have to place any lights at all to bring it up? Would it change basically?
So if first answer is yes, it would absolutely change. I don't like the notion of using fake lights if you can avoid fake. To me, fake lights were just a faster way to work with baked lighting because I paid no penalty for them. Everything gets committed to a texture, so performance overhead wasn't a consideration. But take that Call of Duty World War II shot specifically now with Lumen. I wouldn't use skylight leaking because that would give me horrible nightmares and I would not be able to sleep just knowing a skylight is like pushing through the walls. That would freak me out. I would try to handle it in exposure first because there's a rich amount of data, like even in what looks like, depending on where people have exposure set, it can look like Lumen is too dark, but it's just because exposure is not dialed in. So I'd expose for the interior. Say if outside, in this case, if this was EV9 outside, and we want kind of a 2-stop rise when you go inside, because you don't, or let's take the scenario of like you don't want an exposure shift at all. You just want to hard lock it coming from outside to inside. In that case, I would approach it with probably doing, let's think megalights in terms of the future. I would approach it with image mapped area lights over the windows to basically rebroadcast kind of the outside light information in through the windows to lift them up. But I would try to keep the motivation, I would try to light through the windows as much as possible because that's the only place where the lights are coming from. And that would keep it more grounded and naturalistic.
What would you say if in this level that I'm hovering over, every interior in this level has a separate post-process volume and its only purpose is to hard lock EV? So you've gone in and you've extruded a post-process volume on every interior in Call of Duty World War II on this map, and you've set all the exposures to max min 8 and 8 if it's 2 stops down. Is that something as a workflow, or is that something that you wouldn't do? What are your thoughts on that?
I actually prefer making deliberate decisions like that because it has always given me more control over how I approach the lighting versus, say, you only have one global value. And I know people who work like this, and I appreciate that works for them. But say you set like a range of, okay, let's classic sunny. So EV16, EV15 globally. And then we're going to say this derelict interior warehouse is going to hit, EV4. So that's a huge swing, right? That's an 8 stops. That's a 12-stop transition, which is gonna create some issues in SDR for sure. Like once you go into the interior of the warehouse, your outside view is just gonna nuke out to white.
Okay.
So first step, if it were, and again, these are the kind of things you try to solve. I try to solve in pre-production. Is like, first off, can we open some of these windows? Can we get some holes in the roof to just allow more exterior light to come in and help reduce? If the art director or whoever is like, this is going to be sunny and we want this interior to be dark, it's like, okay, cool. That's a lot of energy that we have to bleed off very quickly crossing a door. So I would try to get some extra environment influence happening. Like any opportunity we have to get exterior light to leak in is cool, especially if it fits narrative or otherwise. But failing that, like say we cannot artificially just allow any more in here, then I would probably reach for local exposure tools for sure, to just say, okay, instead of approaching this from more of a traditional game lighting workflow, my mindset would switch to, we have a raw digital file from a digital camera, and now my job is to develop it in Lightroom. And so that's how I'm going to approach this world of, okay, EV16 outside, EV4 inside, that's a big swing. Let's compress highlight on the post volume inside the warehouse. We're going to tone compress the highlights so they don't scream out quite so much. And we're obviously going to push the shadow intensity a couple of stops to make it a little more visible. And because of Lumen, you're still going to have the projection of outside light through the window openings. So you're still going to get kind of the camera obscura of like skylight color down here and ground color up here. That'll all still happen. But when you start to carve it up, obviously you'll see those colors and everything in the environment. And then as a last resort, if that's even still like, it's kind of extreme, then I would reach for, okay, maybe we tag some of these individual windows with phantom area lights, still sunk to the actual geometry of it. So it's not like just floating above the floor.
It's actually, you fit the area width to, so even if it is a fake light, the player would never know because it's the window.
Exactly right. And if you can, it would actually be outside the window. So even if they, stick their head into the mullions or something, they're
going to get flash of light, flashbang.
Exactly. Because the worst thing to happen is if you have a dynamic area light and someone puts their hand through it and you have this bright flash on one half of the forearm.
Giving me PTSD.
I do help light in some cases when it's really needed, but I try to make it so transparent to just the look of the world that it just looks doomed to have always been that way. Like you just come into a space and it's like, well, of course this is what it would look like, but it's it's naturalistic, but sometimes it's completely authored to be that way.
Yeah, and I guess sometimes interiors some interiors can be L-shaped, S-shaped. Sometimes that process box system, it may or may not work, but I like say pre-production, holistic. I think that is a good way to go on that. I know you put some images
to steal from David Fincher. Fix it in prep.
Fix it in prep, David Fincher.
Yeah,
not post, which is the old saying.
No,
that unfortunately happens a lot. But okay, good. You put some images on this MIRO, which again I'm very thankful for. And I believe these are before and afters. What is it you want to show other than this looking awesome? What is it you want to showcase with this? Is it the approach you've used? How you've gone for interior and exterior? Tell us a bit about these images you put on, Scott.
Yeah, so these are from a saloon scene that an artist, I believe, originally built for the Unity game engine, and then at some point they put it for sale as a marketplace marketplace asset in the Epic marketplace. And so the bottom half of the screenshot is kind of the scene as I inherited it with, the kind of basic light pass it had. And the top shots represent how I changed the look and feel of the whole thing by completely switching to physically based lighting and exposure. And what I like about this kind of 3-up comparison is that even if you do nothing, like I didn't change any of the art assets, I didn't do anything to them. The only thing I did was, instead of what you could call eyeballed or guesstimated lighting values, I just plugged in, I think for this setup, it was something like a high noon situation in Los Angeles. So it was like 90,000 lux of sunlight, of direct sunlight reaching the ground. And the skylight would have been pretty spicy too. I think like 15,000 lux in the shade. And you just force it in through the saloon. And then I set exposure to where I liked it. I think interior exposure was EV 4 or 5, maybe. And then the only, I did change one asset, and that's the candle flame. So I think they had some multiplier on it, which wasn't based off of any measured luminance of a flame. So I literally took my Seconic, pointed it at a candle flame, and it gave me a readout of about 1900 candela of, just the surface of the flame plasma, not the energy emitted from it. And I plugged that into the emissive value of the candle, and that's what 1900 candela looks like in the context of a scene exposed for insanely punchy sunlight. And then I did a few other tweaks of adjusting the volume fog albedo to kind of simulate that blue, Rayleigh scatter contribution that it would do.
Right. If this was at night, would you put point lights above the candles, or would you use? I guess this is a good point for candles and for I'll copy and paste this over. This this, you see this like squiggly sign. Forgive me, anyone watching. I'm not sure what language it is, but for these things that they don't fit the primitive shapes of a spotlight, maybe an area light. What would you do? So would you put a point light above a candle at any point, or use the emissive? Would you put a light on that street sign, or would you use the emissive? What's your approach to those sort of practical lights?
I still prefer kind of discrete light actors for really small objects like that, because you still get the specificity. I can't talk today. You get the specificity of the shadows that they throw, especially with the ray trace shadows that we'll get with megalights. But it's really, really dim, as it should be, but you can see the influence of the point light at the back left of that shot in the lantern. It's barely throwing a shadow.
So there's a point light inside here.
Yes, yeah. There is a point light on every candle flame. And my approach there was to, just give it a little bit of a pill shape, not let it stay spherical, but make it more of like a vitamin or something, and just scale it down to the flame head. And that way, if you zoom in, go ahead.
Did you do the same for this as well then? The candle?
Yep. Yeah.
Oh, so there's a mini. There's if you were to press G, there's like
there'd be a point on each flame tip. Yeah. And that's to just get the really subtle. If you were to zoom in a little bit on the hanging ones on the left shot,
oh yes, yeah,
you'll see just a little bit of reflection of the candle flame, like inside the bits of the lantern. You have to get kind of close on it though, but you would see it.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Pop up. But that's just to handle. It's not really there to do any heavy lifting, because at this exposure value, that light is so dim that it won't be a contributor. But that's kind of the point, right? Is like, all right, here's traditional video game lighting, not based on any rules really, and here's just kind of what you get if you just start by playing by the rules. And then I think once you get to this kind of plateau, then you're absolutely justified to say, okay, well, I want the candles to do more. It's like, okay, it's it's your world. You can get them to be brighter than the sun if you want. I'm comforted by the notion of knowing that, you know, anything that is a light source or glows is based off of something I can measure in reality.
Yeah, this looks awesome as well. So what does this look like behind the scenes? So if I go in and I press G,
Mm-hmm.
I see small point lights attached to each physical light. Do I see any fake lights inside boosting any material response, or is
Nope.
that's exposure, skylight, and directional light?
That's it. Like that's you know what? Let me grab. Wait, new window. We're doing this live.
Yeah.
Let me grab one more shot from that series that isn't there. Oh, I realize you're zooming on your side, but I don't see the zooming on my side. I don't know why I thought it would zoom. You're not controlling my viewport.
No.
Like,
You can if you.
It's not moving.
If you click my profile picture at the top of MIRO, you basically pilot with me.
Gotcha.
So now you should see me zooming in and out and.
Okay. I'm learning. All right.
Yeah, where are you adding this? Let's have a look.
Oh wait, Control V. Here we go.
Yeah, I see.
So this is my favorite key shot from the saloon, but what you're seeing is there's a directional light outside.
Mm-hmm.
There is a small firelight inside for the stove. You can see it throwing on the ground. There's a convolution bloom kernel creating this kind of blue glow around the brighter exposed bits. I didn't get any HDR captures at the time because I wasn't really working in HDR, but you would clearly see the view outside of this overcompressed white. Some transmittance scattering through the curtain materials, but that's it. Every reflection that's on chairs or on the metal is just reflecting the scene as it is. So, you know, true to kind of my working style, I wired up the scene as I believe it would look in reality. But that is all just directional light, skylight, and, you know, little local flourishes on the candles and just exposure and color grading.
Do you do your film grain in editor or is it custom?
Oh, that was all custom Node Tree Science and DaVinci Resolve. And it was actually based off some film scans of Kodak 500T that I have.
I can see
yeah,
it looks like you've made it so it's stronger in highlights and less intense in shadows. Is that correct?
Yeah, and that made me realize I should have posted the other one where I did a stronger filmic emulation.
I've heard both ends of it. I'm like, film grain should be in the shadows, not highlights, and then I've heard it should be in the highlights, not shadows. I don't fully understand it on that level to know which is more appropriate. So it's interesting to see these different takes.
I think it really just comes down to like taste, because there are attributes of what people like about a filmic emulation. So the one on the right kind of has way more specific filmic treatments with legitimate halation that only shows up around highlights. I shot, part of my kind of re-education of seeing light and understand photography was I shot a lot of Kodak cinema film in a stills body for about 3 years. I would scan it, pull it in. So I had a long time to kind of zoom in at 800% and, you know, sample grain structures and stuff and really look at how halation was behaving. But yeah, it was just kind of a fun stylistic exercise, really. I don't have any strong opinions about, you know, clean digital or filmic either way.
Well, yeah, we found that most players they tend to turn off film grain and chromatic aberration for gameplay, but it looks beautiful on renders.
Yeah. Yeah, it's great for a still when you can control it, but if you have any kind of grain path in the renderer and like the TV has sharpening turned on, then it just turns into like worms. Ooh, and it's a bad experience.
What is halation, and can it be done in Unreal, or is it, because you're the second lighting artist I've heard recently talk about halation, doing it in DaVinci versus Unreal. What is it? and how can lighting artists apply it to their work?
So, in a physical sense, what halation is, I have a very poor visual aid here.
Yeah.
Felt, pink felt. So, in a frame of typical 35 millimeter or 65, whatever, any modern Kodak cinema stock, regardless of its size, it's called a negative because obviously it records an image that looks inverted. White is black and shadow is light on it. And then when it gets processed, that negative becomes an inner positive and looks normal. But the dye layers of a frame of film, you know what? Before I tell anyone the wrong information, let me make sure I have my science right.
Gonna come for you.
Film. Yeah. Film dye layers. Okay. This is talking about it in the positive. That's wrong, guys. Okay. Yeah, literally Wikipedia. Thanks, Wikipedia. So in a frame of film, you have cyan is the last layer that light hits. Above cyan is the magenta dye. Above magenta would be yellow.
Okay.
Now, when you flip those, because it's subtractive, right? We're not talking about light, we're talking more about dye. But when cyan gets processed, the opposite of cyan is red, the opposite of magenta is green, and the opposite of yellow is blue. So you have blue, green, red of the light path through a frame of film. On the very bottom, felt coasters are coming in handy. So if this would be the last cyan layer, you have, what did we say? Blue, green, red in the positive. Behind all of that is this carbon layer called remjet. And its function is to capture the light exiting out of the back of the film and kind of stop it from scattering all over the place. It is still going to do that a little bit, but because the remjet is attached to the cyan red layer, when light strikes this layer, hits the remjet and bounces up just a little bit, you get a little extra bleed. And that's what halation is. So if you have things that are particularly bright, that light energy will bounce off of the remjet and re-enter the cyan layer, that when it gets flipped to red in the chemical bath, will render as a reddish kind of amber glow, depending on how the film's been processed, depending on how it's been color graded.
So
that's it. It's just a physical. Yeah. Yep. Exactly. Where you're highlighting it.
But it's not this. Is it also this like teal lens, or is that lens flare? This sort of glow.
That's the convolution bloom. Yeah, that's the default. Epic's, I think, Canon lens sampled. Whenever you turn on convolution in the engine, that's the default kernel.
Line, okay.
Yeah.
You're doing that in DaVinci, so I'm assuming
Correct.
It's not possible in Unreal yet without plugins.
I think you could do it programmatically. The idea would be similar. I don't have a shot of the node graph of how this was created and resolved, but the idea is you would look at kind of the linear raw frame buffer, and you'd have a really aggressive curve that isolates just the brightest bits. I mean, technically, every pixel will contribute to halation, but only the brightest ones you'll see the edge difference. But you could isolate that in a buffer and then do a find edge operation on it, or blur it and like take the difference of the blur, color it, and then recomposite it onto the base. I don't imagine it would be difficult to do in real time. That'd actually be really cool.
Technical lighting
something to try. Exactly. Yeah. Get us some Kodak accurate halation, please. That would be cool. But I also find, and I try to keep it subtle in these examples, even though it's a little bit spicy, but everyone likes the appearance of halation on 8mm, which is really big because that film is really tiny. So an object rendered to it would, there'd be more bleed over someone's head versus you're shooting a frame of 65mm, their head is this small and the grains are really dense. if you look at a still frame of anything from Christopher Nolan, it's really hard to see halation. Because
you
the
spice it up
bigger,
a little bit for the render.
exactly, yeah. And that's, because it's a digital effect, it's all controllable. You can control how soft it is. You could control its color. Who's to say you couldn't have neon pink halation? You can do whatever you want. Be fancy.
I also see it on
green.
I think I see it on the Western doors as well. I see a slight halo of it, I believe.
Yep. Yeah. Anywhere around the highest contrast would work. But you can see too, especially around the foot of that stove is where it's really popping.
Yeah, for anyone's looking on it's
and you can see why, like, you kind of need physically based values to get there. Because if I just had that sunlight set to the default of 5, well, what is 5 lux? That's 5 times brighter than open face moonlight. Like, that's not even close. And so the energy that's in there is creating, that contrast for Resolve to really see it.
And if I looked at the min-max exposure, would I assume to see compensation 0 and min-max at the same value, or what would that look like?
That actually gets me to my favorite, and what I think the simplest part of exposure, which is just the Ansel Adams zone system, right? So 18% gray is always middle zone of 5. Oh, you know what? It's time for another infograph.
I've not heard of this before. Ansel Adams.
Oh my God. This is going to blow your mind. This is good. I get to educate the educator.
Oh no, dude, like with lighting, I'm only like 2 years in, bro. So this is like, to me, this is like S tier principal level knowledge bombs. It's insanity. I love it.
Gotcha. Is this one? Yeah, sure. This is pretty explanatory. All right, coming down. That's tiny. Okay. So the zone system. Ansel Adams, very famous photographer in the early or middle 19th century, however it's considered. 20th century? I don't know. 1930s through 40s and 50s. He was here a while ago. But the zone system is a very simple, I think, mental way of thinking about exposure and where things should sit. We're talking specifically about exposure compensation with this, basically. So the assumption is that you have satisfied middle gray, right? That's in the zone system. 5 or V is the middle. That's always middle gray. That's what every light meter of a camera wants to get to. If you point it at black asphalt, it will raise it to middle gray. If you point it at snow, it will duck it to middle gray.
Right.
The camera spot meter, same thing in Unreal. A camera spot meter doesn't know what you're pointing it at. It doesn't know the nature of snow. It doesn't know the nature of asphalt. So you have to tell it, okay, if I'm going to spot meter this asphalt, I know you desperately want to raise it up to here and make it gray, but what I'm seeing is black with a little bit of texture to my eye. So that is 2 stops under middle gray. So if you want to photograph something, that brings us down to zone 2, which is the first suggestion of texture, deep tonality, darkest part of an image in which you want to hold on to texture. So if you want your asphalt to look like asphalt as it does to you in your eye, you would tell your camera, I need you to underexpose this thing I'm pointed at by 2 stops. You take a picture, you load up, you don't even have to go into RAW to see this. You look at the JPEG, hold it up to reality, it looks exactly like what you're seeing. Versus if you left it alone, the spot meter says, this looks really dark. We need to make it middle gray. So we're going to boost gain by 2 stops. That's wrong, because now your relationship of everything else in the scene is based off of a wrong calibration, basically. On the other side, if you want a very bright, sunlit, snow-covered mountain scene to feel bright, you're definitely not going to expose it at 0, because that white snow is going to look like dull gray concrete, and that's not what it looks like. So whether in Unreal or otherwise, you would set exposure compensation to +2, maybe +3 if you really want it to pop. We're not clipping the signal when we do this. Everyone's afraid of clipping where it highlight slams and there's just nothing else. We are deliberately controlling exposure based off the nature of the art we're exposing for.
Right.
And that's it, really. So like you dial in the world in Unreal, you satisfy the exposure value to get 18% gray to be calibrated. Cool. But what's the situation? Is it overcast? Maybe you can leave it at 0 because it's close enough to gray. If you want it to be moody, maybe pull it a stop, -1. If it's sunny, you're definitely going to want to start at least at +2 so that sunny feels sunny and not, horror movie zombies are coming to eat your face, dark, depressing, which you can do, right? Like that's creative. That's creative intent to say, no, I want my sunlight to live 2 stops underexposed because ABC, whatever.
So you have a base EV value for the saloon, which I said you said was you say it was 6.
Probably 4 or 5 is usually where my interiors tend to end up if it's particularly bright outside.
So in min and max, that's both set to 4.
If the goal was just the inside of the saloon and you could never transition outside, yes, that would be true. And it would just maintain this look without any kind of swing. If it were possible to transition outside, I would prefer to hard set my EV inside the saloon to exactly where I want it to display that environment. And then I would just set a really soft transition distance back to outside, where it swings back up to 16. And obviously, as you approach the door, it's going to, in HDR, you could see outside. It would just be really bright. But in SDR, it's gone. That's why I hate SDR. I'm telling you, I'm never going back. But as you approach the door, the view outside would, come into view. And then the saloon behind you would start to duck way down and would probably approach black in a photographic sense.
Into some of the things you've been saying throughout this talk, that when you have a harsh transition like that, it can cause motion sickness, but also be quite like, too much of a flash. So I guess using those, I guess what you do, EV15 outside, and you would hard lock it inside with, I don't know, like a post process or something like that. And you try and try your best to make the transition. I guess you can only make the transition so smooth between bounding boxes, right, with the blend weight.
Yeah, it depends on how much depth you have to work with. If you're going through a hallway versus just a straight threshold, like outside saloon, that's a lot to. It's a very quick change, very quickly.
There's a technique I've heard recently that is based around this problem, and maybe you've heard of it and can explain it a little. If not, I think it's something very specific that came from Cyberpunk, where they had this issue where when you're inside on SDR, I'll paraphrase a little bit just in case I'm wrong, you can't see outside. So they would divide their sun by 100. Something from a Cyberpunk talk I've seen. A friend of mine, Lucas, who's a senior lighting guy, he's been talking about how he divides his sun looks by 100 purely so that the outside is visible. And I can't visualize how that works yet, but it seems what they did on Cyberpunk as well.
If I recall, they did something similar on I think the first and second, maybe just the second Mirror's Edge game, where they went fully dynamic. Similar problem. So it would totally work. And basically the visual effect is that if you're still rocking with interior exposure values when looking outdoors, in the context of SDR, I'll say comparatively between the two. If we're only talking about SDR, it's a hack that works fine, because something illuminated by 1,000 nits is still comfortably north of, sorry, not 1,000 nits, 1,000 lux. It's still comfortably hitting the ceiling of what SDR can represent. but you would see a little more specificity in like distance. The fog wouldn't be quite so hot, so you could see more depth. You could see the structure of things looking out of a window if you take the sun from 120,000 and drop it to 1,000. But if you do this in HDR, it would be a little bit trickier to hide it because the difference would be really apparent. Like going from, well, divided by 100, 100,000 divided by 100, you take off 2 zeros, right? So, yeah, 1,000, I think. I am not confident in my simple math skills.
Is potato.
1,000 times 100. 100,000. Okay, so it would go down to 1,000. I think in HDR you would see that shift a lot more readily. But I mean, it's definitely one way to manage what is an insane difference in dynamic range. I mean, natural daylight is pretty intense. The approach I would take is more, what is it? Don't damn the messenger, damn the message kind of thing. So I would leave, I wouldn't actually change the energy of the sun. I would park it, but then I would fall back on the engineering of the tone map to, again, the mindset that I connect with most is more like, I mean, it's a frame buffer in a game engine, but it's still based, for all intents and purposes, a raw image to be interpreted.
Yeah.
So if we can have control over local highlight, range compression, and shadow compression, I would rather build and author the lighting once, know that that data is good, and then my mindset becomes, okay, in this extreme, what do we have to kind of push and pull to get it to fit, right? Get the full range of the data to compress to what you want to see versus changing local intensities. And, you know, it might make some decision making harder, but I like the simplicity of that personally.
Because in my brain, like I said, I haven't really tackled in and outside exposure yet because I worked on a horror game where everything's at night. If your sun is 1,000 and you go outside, what I don't understand is if you go outside, your sun is gonna not look like daytime if you do that
Correct
divide trick. So I don't know if it keyframes back up to 100,000.
I'm sure they. Yeah, I would have to assume that if, again, I don't know how they're doing it. I've just seen similar approaches before. You could track like player distance into an interior and use that as a straight lerp as they reapproach it, in which case you'd have to have metadata on like every door.
That'd be cool.
You could, like I said, you can do it. Again, lazy artist mindset. It's like, nope, okay, we've gotten ourselves into a pickle. The sun's really bright. Maybe we could set this at evening time. It would also look more interesting. Like, you know, why don't we find a situation that gets us better pictures, but also technically satisfies kind of the image flatness we want to have. And failing that, again, we have really cool engineering in the Tonemapper that can absolutely directly override and squeeze everything in as you need it to.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So I guess if you wanted this image to stay the same everywhere, you would have locked in, 4-on-4. But I guess you've done like 4 max, 5 min to get a little bit of exposure. What do you, or do you just hard lock? Would you just hard lock it completely? 5 and 5. If it was just pure interior,
Yeah, I prefer more of a hard lock if we're doing something. I would use air quotes, but it actually, if we're doing something more cinematic focused, of like, hey, we want this game to feel like a movie. Cool. What you don't see in movies is exposure doing this, depending on where the camera is aimed, because
True.
That is literally someone's job to ride the iris of the lens, and they're very good at what they do. And, if you have wild ranging exposure, you cannot control what the scene looks like. You can't guarantee the fill ratio, the direct lighting. You have lost authorship of the scene in reality. And I'm not a cinematographer as much as I pretend to be and would love to be a cinematographer. I appreciate the mindset of like, no, you know what? We've made a decision. This is our exposure bucket. This is how much energy we're prepared to field in this environment. This is what we intended you to see. This is what we're lighting to. End of discussion. Like, beautiful. That makes sense. However, I think there is a case to be made for, and the Battlefield games have actually done, I forget which one, Battlefield 5, Battlefield 4. I think Battlefield 5. One of them. There's the one where it was still kind of modern, but before they had tornadoes. I forget. There've been so many. But they would have this map. I forget the name of the map, but it was in like this mining tunnel thing. And they had a very deliberate exposure thing, which I thought was cool from a gameplay mechanics perspective of if you're deep in this mining tunnel looking out, you can see the blackened silhouettes of enemies coming to get you in the tunnel. If you are outside looking in the tunnel, you couldn't see anyone because you're exposed for the sunlight that you're standing in. So it created this really cool gameplay advantage of if you're in the cave, then you kind of have the high ground, even though you're literally below everyone, because they can't see you. So they have to blindly charge in, and then the exposure comes up, and oh crap, there are 15 campers here waiting to take my head off. I think that's really cool. Again, that would make a much less sense in HDR, because in an HDR situation, you have all the luminance data in the world to both. You can see the shadows fine, and the sun is hot. Like, that's the beauty of not having a bucket this tiny, but one that's, Olympic-sized swimming pool.
I need it, man. I need it.
It's good, and it helps you, even in these extremes that you're kind of pointing to here, these tunnels, which again, bake lighting, Unreal Engine 4.25, that was a while ago.
Okay.
But I just wanted to, I've been working on kind of a happy tropical environment on the shark game, Maneater. And I was like, I just need to see something heavy and naturalistic and simple. And that was just an overcast environment. And like, that's it. Like, it's just a skylight and really decent rock materials. That's it. There's nothing else helping it.
There's no directional light?
It's just, nope. Just skylight.
So this shadow, is this coming from the skylight in direct, or?
Oh, I think I'm lying to your face.
I've sussed you out, good sir.
Okay. Let me walk that back. There existed a version, Elliot, in which it had no directional, but in these images, I have been sussed out to be a dirty liar who lies a lot. Yes, in these, this has an active directional, but it wasn't a major contributor. You're getting some weird,
you can tell it's not
shadow artifacts from like the fronds and stuff, but if it were turned off, say, it wouldn't make a huge difference. But I think because it was a bake, I want to say I did set the bounce intensity on it because it was so dim. I set it to like 4 or something, and I liked that it was giving me more saturation in the bounce between the rocks. So it's not a physically based decision, but because I was playing in the rules of the context of actual overcast, I was allowed to break the rules because I created the world, basically.
Yeah, it's my world.
It's my world, and the rocks are going to bounce more color because I say so. But yeah, this to me, even though it's not technically impressive and, artistically dubious at best, I like just how little goes into it. And like literally the rest of it comes from composition and, what you're aiming at or whatever. Yeah. And Rayleigh scattering at fog. I never get over that blue cobalt color.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's one thing I was going to ask you. the last few relights I've done, I've used HDRI, the HDRI plugin, and I've used Heightfog. I haven't used Sky Atmosphere yet. What would be the
it's
difference
fun.
other than, because I believe isn't the Rayleigh something like the something like the dust particles in the sky that the lighting picks up, something like what
Yeah.
Heightfog versus Sky Atmosphere? Should I start using a Sky Atmosphere even if it's a HDRI texture on the sky, or what's the difference?
Yeah. So what the Sky Atmosphere, as it's wired in Unreal, has a 1D LUT or a 2D LUT on it that even if you don't change the directional light intensity, let's say you just peg it at 120,000, just build noon in all the time. The logic of the Sky Atmosphere, it looks up the angle of the directional light to the horizon, and it will dynamically interpolate the atmospheric scattering that a directional light would do, such that if you get it down to a few degrees of the horizon, it'll be bold and red and amber, because it will actually scatter away the blue light as the atmosphere does. If you put it in the top of the sky where it would be like noonish, then it's blue, and it kind of looks like you would expect.
Can you do that without changing? Because I believe when you do that, you change the sky color and the cloud color. Is there a way to just have that affect the fog and not change the sky color? Like if you have like an early morning HDRI and you plug it into the sky.
Gotcha. And you're using the HDRI like for a display, like primary
use
visibility?
the brightness brings up the skylight.
Gotcha.
Can I use it with that, or is that a different sort of workflow?
If you have the HDRI on a sky mesh or do you have a cube HDRI plugged into the skylight actor, or is it literally HDRI on a dome?
When you go to plugins, HDRI plugin, what it does, it makes a skylight and a sky dome, and it has all this shade. It links them together, so when you change the brightness of the HDRI, the skylight changes with it, which is, I think, meant to be physically accurate.
Right.
So I'm just wondering if I use that with. That's why I've been using Heightfog, because I didn't think that Sky Atmosphere would work if there's no actual sky system and it's a texture.
That's interesting. I can't say I've ever used the. I haven't tested that workflow before. The HDRI plugin with kind of a traditional world setup. I have no idea.
Oh.
That actually makes me want to try it.
Yeah, I've been using it for a ton of stuff, because there was I was talking to someone about it, and because in other lighting videos I've seen, people make their own setup where they link their skylight to the sky. Because one of the things I remember seeing about physical accuracy is that you shouldn't separate your skylight from your sky brightness.
Correct. Yeah.
So your skylight should pretty much always be at. I think your skylight should always be at 1, but then the sky brightness is what brings the ambient values into the scene. So I think that's what the plugin does. But you also agree with the fact that I guess, and if you're not using the HDRI plugin, when you work on a game, you or someone at some point sets up the skylight to be linked to the 3D clouds or the time of day or whatever.
Yeah, in a typical setup, I would leave the skylight actor just set to sample dynamically, like during changes, so it's always looking at whatever is in the sky art. And in the case of, I've done both, where I've used the procedural just sky atmosphere and Unreal volume clouds. Those are kind of expensive though, like in a runtime sense. So I think, something that gets you a lot of bang for your buck is just having a really nice, sampled HDRI of whatever weather or beautiful sunset you want, map it to the sky sphere, and then say it has, visible sunlight. You would kind of calibrate it to be the same intensity as what you measured, or hopefully if like you're buying the HDRI from someplace, they have the numbers that they had at the time of acquisition. Otherwise, you're kind of guessing, which is also valid. Like you could get an overcast HDRI. Let's say you don't know the values, but you do know that it's overcast. There's nothing wrong with saying, no, you know what? I want my overcast to live at EV10, because it's there's bright overcast, there's dark overcast. It's more just being like, yeah, this is the decision I'm going to make, and this is how we're going to work. It's the repeatability and consistency of it before anything else.
Okay. Cool.
But yeah, no, specific to the HDRI plugin in Sky Atmosphere, I have no idea. You have me stumped, Elliot.
I'll send you a thing about it. I think it just basically plugs them together and you can change them. But I guess that's the second now that confirms it that your skylight brightness shouldn't decouple from your sky. So if
you definitely want a linear relationship.
Yeah, if your art director says, "Hey, I like this, but I want to keep the shadows down a bit and keep the sky brightness," I guess as a lighting artist, you are the expert, and you would. It's okay to respectfully share your opinion with an art director who is higher in the hierarchy, especially as a mid or a junior, that I don't think we should do that. We're going to break accuracy. I would like to keep it like this, but if you really want to do it like that, we can do it. Because I think art directors, they don't necessarily know PBL. So is it okay for lighting artists to try and keep PBL as much as possible? Or when is it seen too much as like this person's saying no constantly and they get a reputation? Like, how do you teeter that line of we want to stay accurate? Or is that, as you said earlier, that you only choose studios that will work accurate? So there's already that premise.
I've been in both situations, and when it seemed like I was gonna be, butting heads with whoever the powers that be over what I believed to be the right decisions, and I still do. It's like literally the foundation of my career, that let's just do real and then bend it if we need to, but always start real. It's so much more controllable. But what I would try to do in that case is, okay, cool. You really feel strongly about an approach I disagree with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you my gut decision done correctly, and then I'm going to show you what you want. And let's just put the two images next to each other. Now, which one do you want to buy? And 8 times out of 10, if they didn't have, their own personal confirmation bias, they would accept, wow, yeah, doing it. I like that picture better when we don't direct it to death. And I'm like, cool. But you do realize that this is a starting point. This isn't what we're going to ship. This is simply, hey, here's the base values. This is what it gets us. Now, where do we go from here? Versus that's the collaboration that I'm fine with. Hey, you're going to have a visceral reaction to this. I know it. Just prepare yourself. Here's what we get out of the renderer. Now, what about this starting point don't you like? And we can mold it from there. Versus you have someone who kind of wants you to get to the final image as the starting point. And with a physical workflow, that is very difficult to do. What I liked about the experience of working on Call of Duty is because that was just the pedigree of how, the Sledgehammer people had set up their pipeline, which is like, yeah, this is normal to us. This is easy. It's kind of a brain transplant when you get into it. But once you get into it, it's like drinking the Kool-Aid. You'll kind of understand this is better in its own way. But yeah, if any powers that be feel really strongly about something, they're allowed to feel that way. It's, everyone has their own personal sensibility. What I disagree with, though, is the notion that, oh, well, you're just a lighting artist, you should just do it, right? Like, just implement the vision as I see it. Like, no. There's some education that needs to take place here. I need you to understand what you're asking, because to you, it's a 1-sentence question or ask. To me, it's 6 months of work. So let's try to get everyone on the same page and just get the best image possible, really.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that has to do with timing and work history. So, for example, you are a principal. If you come into a studio with your background, titles you've worked on, and your reputation, people are going to, listen to you, even without maybe showing how things could be. Whereas if you come in as a mid, maybe again you have to show those before afters. I'm a big fan of before afters. Like I live by MIRO, like before after everything, because art directors and lead artists they'll probably forget what they told you. They'll roughly remember, but they're so busy. Like they're so busy that having a MIRO, I have a MIRO and I have bookmarks and Unreal and I can go back to that level whenever. Which brings me to the next one. Principal's pretty. It's like an end game boss level, right? So I only know a handful of principals. What is a principal? How do you go from, because some studios they do senior 1, senior 2. UK doesn't really do that. UK just goes senior. Good luck. You got your different types of seniors.
Sky's the limit after that point.
How does one become a principal? There's not exactly many studios recruit for a principal. What is that turning point? Is it just tenure, or is there something else to it?
To the first part of how I became a principal, sheer dumb luck, actually, as is so often the case, as I'm sure you've experienced. The head of art at my current studio saw, funny enough, that interview. Why can't I remember the name of the podcast? Creator Forge.
Yes.
He saw the Creator Forge podcast and sent me a message. It wasn't a message or a greeting so much, and I've ribbed him about this before, so it's nothing but love. But he sent me a message and he's like, "Hey, you haven't accomplished what you've set out to do yet, have you?" I'm like, "What? Who are you?" But his point was like, you know, we feel that your work kind of represents a visual style that is more like, I don't know, movie like or whatever, and so it doesn't. He was confused by the projects that I've been working on with kind of cultivating my visual style. He's like, "Why don't you do something that's more, you know, narrative driven?" I'm like, "I've never even thought of that." But truly, that's how I became a principal. Was because there was one of me, and I was heading up basically all things lighting for my new studio. And so, as I understand it, there's a principal track and kind of a leadership track where you're directly managing. And I hate how impersonal this term is, but you're managing reports, you know, i.e. other human artists below you, if you will, which I also don't like that descriptor. But you're responsible for people and their careers. So that sends you on a lead, which means you get to take the shrapnel of all the meeting hell that happens with talking about things. And on the principal track, you have, all right, I am full IC individual contributor. I'm going to be head down with headphones on in the dark corner, just cranking out awesome stuff and talking cross departments as needed. That's really the big difference. But in terms of the responsibilities that I gained jumping to principal versus when I was a senior is very much like, at least everyone has a different senior experience or whatever, different companies, different people, different regions of the world. As a senior, it was really just, all right, your focus is the pretty pictures and performance and stuff, and just rock out. As a principal, that's still true, and that's still my main focus, is making great stuff. But I'm also making, frankly, company-wide decisions as far as artistic approaches or what's important from a rendering perspective in tandem with the actual tech directors. It gave me a little bit more of a seat at the table of like where the adults work. I'm no longer just delegated to the kids section of the restaurant. I actually get to they gave me a high chair to sit at the big table. That's more what it is. From my experiences, you have more visibility on bigger decisions being made across art departments and how you can be more involved in kind of that pre-planning process we've talked about, where yeah, you will meet with leaders of the other departments and talk about target albedo values, or let's avoid pure saturated textures because it'll freak out ASUS and it can't handle that blue because you get, not a number of values under the hood in ASUS, and that's really bad for color, and here's it breaking, so please don't do that. So it's part data wrangler, part what's the term? Part someone who's hired by a company to like be excited about a product. What's that called? Enthusiast? No. Sure, enthusiast.
Yeah, enthusiast.
There's a different term. It's not entrepreneur. Oh, that's gonna bug me, and I'll remember it tonight in bed at like 2 a.m. I'd be like, "That's the word."
Message me.
Yeah, got it. I forget the word.
Does that?
But you go ahead.
Does that? No, sorry. You finish. I'll go after this because it's a slight topic in the same topic but slight change. You carry on with it.
So yeah, senior to principal for me was you get a bigger seat at the decision-making table. You have more oversight over studio-wide dynamics, and it's all the creative stuff kind of comes with you. You're still expected to make images. You're still expected to work with performance and rendering and everyone. But yeah.
Yeah, we have different names here. We have principal, and we have an advanced lighting guys, and then some places call them lighting directors, but they're all essentially I wish the games industry could just. I like the tier system: senior 1, 2, 3, principal 1. With you being principal,
it's easier to keep up with, certainly.
Yeah, God, especially with salaries, man. That's something else completely. With you being principal now, does it not so much pigeonhole you, but does it change the strategy of where you choose to work? Because I've noticed you seem to be at like a Worlds Untold. It feels like a smaller. Please correct me if I'm wrong. This feels small, AA that is probably doing AAA stuff. Your principal role fits in there with the size of it, and it's probably at the beginning of a project. Does you being principal now change your, you're doing quests when you're a senior, you're doing quests to go work on, different games, and you could work on anything, slot in at any point. Are you now at like raid level quests where you're only really interested at being at the pipeline stage and seeing what you've done and going through that and then going to the pipeline stage again? Or can you just jump in somewhere that everything is already set, or,
Another excellent question. For me, there was a really cool interview with the composer John Brion, Jonbrion. He's an amazing composer, and is on like an actor's studio interview where I think the host asked him, like, when you're making things musically, do you like to be completely in control of over the whole process, or are you okay being a little more submissive to someone making kind of decisions on your behalf, and it's more of like a collaboration? And his response was pretty cool, where he's like, the happiest people I've seen are people who have a mix of both or multiple mindsets of roles that they play throughout their life. The types of people who they need to have control over every single thing, in his opinion, tend to be a little more miserable. But on the opposite of that, people who never really speak up and always feel submissive to, oh, well, everything is happening without me, they're also kind of not as happy as they could be. But the people who are like, all right, in this situation, I get to drive everything. In this situation, I get to take marching orders. In this situation, it's a little bit of both. He thought that was a pretty cool balance, and I thought that was a really neat answer. I mean, where I am now, I'm definitely driving a lot, but only I think because of how, new the studio is. Hypothetically, if we expand and bring on more people, it'll become more of a dynamic where, there'll be people who obviously might take more of the lighting role so that I can focus on something else. But I guess not to avoid answering the question directly, but I like.
No, because it's NDA stuff, obviously. But
oh well, no, not specific to Worlds Untold, but just in the terms of I like that I've had a mix so far in my career of, I was on a bigger lighting team of like 8 people working on Call of Duty, and that was really cool because then way back in the old days when we worked in a building together next to each other, you could just tap someone on the shoulder and just be like, "Hey, am I crazy or does this look like crap?" And then you that looks like crap. You just get that live sounding sanity check. And that was cool to just live in the perspective of 7 other people who weren't me, to think outside of my own horse blinders. But in a different but equal parts, I am just as at home being kind of the sole decision maker of establishing anything, because there's a front part of like, it's a bunch of technical stuff, it's a lot of discussions, you have to figure out process. That's fine, but once I get to be in the editor making things and passing it off to gameplay and interacting with the environment artist, that's like the fun part. Whether I'm doing that as a lone wolf operator or doing that in the context of a team, just the fact that I get to be in there making stuff is what makes me the most happy about it, really.
Amazing. I consider myself a mid-free. My next job, I hope to be either mid-free or senior 1, and I'm specifically looking for being in a lighting team. I'm not really interested in the opportunities where I'm the only lighting artist, because I want to, learn with a team.
Yeah.
And we were all very fresh at my last studio. And we didn't really have a lead, so we kind of all learned from each other. So my goal is to go somewhere that has a Scott or someone that I can like ask these questions, but also obviously provide my value to. And then eventually, sometime in the next 6 to 8 years, I will feel comfortable enough with the tools to be like, let's head up and work on something and go for that principal role. But right now, I do yearn for, like you say, the being with the 7 people and saying, "Hey, does this look shit?" That's what my goal is.
And the teaching and learning aspect is just, it's so great in both directions. Like the main reason that I continue to love the game industry is more people than not want to help you with learning something new, or they're not precious with their information because they're not. My least favorite type of people to have worked with are, they hoard information like it's their lifeblood, and if they share it with you, they'll just die on the spot. And I learned, very quickly that that's not, sharing what you know with someone doesn't give away your competitive advantage. No. If anything, it can only help elevate the rest of, literally the industry. And that's proof positive by, like, Roger Deakins, very celebrated cinematographer, has a free website where he literally draws lighting diagrams of his big decision making on all of his movies. Now, if you take all the information and do it, it doesn't make you Roger Deakins. You're still not going to make the same decisions with his sensibility. That's what makes him Roger Deakins. Yeah. And so everyone has their own way of how they see the world. I have my own way of how I see light. I have a way of where I prefer exposure to sit. I like darkness and shadows. I like very high contrast. I like kind of sad bent colors. Like instead of a pure screen white point, I like for that to sit around 5,000 Kelvin. I like for there to be color in things.
Yeah.
But that's me, you know. It would be wrong for me to tell someone else, this is how you should think. I think the best thing you can do for people is like, what do you like about it? How do you see it? What makes you happy in terms of image making? And then like you cultivate that perspective, because then you get a different view of the world versus like carbon copying your own perspective and presenting it like it's the way, which I don't agree with that kind of mode of teaching. It's one perspective, but it's not the perspective.
And that's the people you want to work with, especially people that are super knowledgeable. When you get stressed
they're just selfless.
They're figure out what to do.
Exactly. They love what they're doing. They love learning. They love teaching. And they're just trying to make really cool stuff with the room of other smart people making their own cool stuff. That's it, man.
Awesome, man. And as a final question, you gone from junior, mid, senior, principal. That's like what, 10? How many years again? That's like 20,
that's 18.
Jesus, man.
It's a lot.
It doesn't, if you don't mind me saying, it doesn't reflect that. I mean, you look like you're barely late 20s, bro. Where's that? Did you start when you were 10?
It's my moisturizer. Thank you for noticing. It keeps my skin tight and youthful.
So you said 18, right? Or something like that. 18.
Yeah, I joined right when I was 19, right out of, well, a year after high school, where I folded jeans for a year and decided I really hated that. But yeah,
so you're pretty much, in terms of the lighting artist role, pretty much as high as you can go role wise. Next 5 years, what's up? What I want to say upwards. What's the next career goal? Because for most it is to get principal. You are principal, so
yeah. Well, I mean, there would be kind of the operational track of like, oh, you're a lighting director now. It's
so
like,
that's actually a higher role over there than principal.
Yeah, yeah. So again, at least as far as I understand, there's like principal track where you could end up being, I don't know, I think that terminates at expert. So it's like principal and expert is like the sophomore version of a principal or something. Yeah. I think they just need a way to track different bands, and they give them, different gold stars. And then on the other side, you would have lead lighting, and that would probably be like senior lead or expert lead or something. And then ultimately, you would probably be the decision maker for the company as an entity, and that would put you in director territory.
That's the goal, right?
And as a director, you'd probably be dealing with multiple sub teams and multiple principals and leads. It's a lot. It's not something that I think I would want to do. I like being in the weeds on stuff. I like making things. I like using the tools and kind of playing, the lighting tools like a keyboard to affect what's on screen, like striking that first light, especially lately, and like seeing it in HDR. It's like, cool, we've made our first decision, and now we just have to light the rest of the world every time.
I need HDR monitor.
We have to get you hooked up with one. They're getting better all the time, and they're definitely getting more affordable all the time. And backlight zones are getting better, and kind of the spill control. But we're getting there slowly.
Yeah, that's one of the things for me next. At least one HDR monitor, not two HDR. That's probably a bit too expensive. One SDR. One HDR. But dude, honestly, Scott, brother, it's thank you so much. Like 2 hours, 21 minutes.
Oh wow!
Which has flown by. You are the easiest person to talk to, and you're so humble with your knowledge, and it reflects what you were saying of you don't want people to hoard knowledge, you want people to give knowledge, but also be super friendly. And like, I can already imagine what working with you in a studio would be like through all different parts of the roller coaster, and it would be something awesome. So, dude, thank you very much. What's happening in Scott's world? Do you want to shout anything out, like your YouTube, your portfolio? Have you got anything coming up? Tell the people what's going on in Scott's world.
Oh my goodness, it is Hot Ones, just without the hot sauce. And I have
feel
some
I'm
of the last
bumping
tab.
even on
It's a good format. No, it's funny enough. I'm just I'm working on very secret stuff with a bunch of very smart people, and hopefully we are making something very fun. But
Awesome.
no, Elliot, thank you for having me on, man. This has been very easy to chat with you and very fun, sir.